Erica thought the night would bring excitement. Kevin believed it would save their marriage. Laura only wanted to feel desired again. Tony planned to take it further than anyone expected. By morning, 3 of them would be dead, and 1 would be left standing in the ashes, hiding the truth no one would ever believe. Mark and Lisa appeared to have the perfect marriage on the outside. They lived in a beautiful suburban home in Dallas, drove expensive cars, and often hosted gatherings for their friends. Their smiles were bright, their conversations warm, but beneath the surface, their marriage had started to fade. The excitement that once bonded them had turned into a quiet routine of responsibilities, bills, and shallow conversations. Lisa felt unseen while Mark felt unappreciated. They both carried silent frustrations that neither dared to voice. It was in that fragile state of their relationship that they met Ethan and Rachel, a younger, more spontaneous couple who lived life on the edge. Ethan was charming, confident, and unpredictable. Rachel was lively and carefree, the kind of woman who turned every ordinary evening into an adventure. The 2 couples met through mutual friends at a social event and quickly became close. Their weekends soon filled with dinners, small trips, and endless laughter. They shared drinks, secrets, and a growing sense of connection that blurred the boundaries of friendship. What began as harmless fun slowly grew into something riskier. Lisa admired Ethan's attention, his way of making her feel alive again. Mark, in turn, found himself flattered by Rachel's constant flirting. The tension between all 4 became almost tangible, though no one dared to mention it aloud. It was during one late-night gathering that everything changed. The air was filled with the buzz of alcohol and the pulse of music, and the conversation drifted into forbidden territory. They joked about trust, boundaries, and fantasies that couples rarely discussed in public. What began as teasing words turned into an idea, a wild suggestion about trading partners just once. The room went silent for a moment, but then laughter broke the tension. Yet that laughter carried curiosity, not rejection. The idea lingered long after the night ended, nesting quietly in each of their minds. Over the following days, Lisa couldn't stop thinking about it. The thrill of doing something forbidden tempted her in ways she had never imagined. She convinced herself it would be harmless, a secret adventure that would reignite her dull marriage. Mark, though hesitant at first, became equally intrigued. Perhaps he thought it could break their monotony and bring something new into their lives. Ethan and Rachel, being more open and daring, were quick to agree. Soon the plan was set. A private weekend at a secluded cabin outside the city. No one else would know. It would be their secret experiment in pleasure and trust. The night arrived faster than they expected. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense trees and a lake that shimmered under the moonlight. Inside, the atmosphere was filled with a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Candles flickered, soft music played, and the wine flowed freely. What began as laughter soon shifted into something more intimate, and all 4 crossed a line they could never uncross. The night felt surreal, filled with desire, confusion, and fleeting satisfaction. But as dawn approached, the weight of what they had done began to settle in. The morning after was silent. No one spoke about what happened. They all pretended it was casual, a fun experience to move past, but each of them carried something different home. Lisa felt a strange attachment to Ethan, a sense of warmth and understanding that she hadn't felt from Mark in years. Mark, on the other hand, felt an unfamiliar bitterness, a gnawing discomfort that he couldn't explain. He had agreed to it, but now he couldn't erase the image of his wife with another man. Ethan, meanwhile, became obsessed. The connection he felt with Lisa wasn't fleeting, it consumed his thoughts entirely. Rachel noticed his distraction almost immediately. She saw how he glanced at his phone, how he lingered in silence, how he seemed lost in another world. What had started as a shared thrill quickly turned into emotional chaos. The 4 of them stopped meeting as often, each couple retreating into their own world. But for Ethan and Lisa, distance only made things worse. Ethan began texting her in secret, and Lisa, craving attention, replied. Their conversations turned personal, then romantic, and soon they were meeting alone. They told themselves it was harmless, just talking, but it wasn't. Their encounters became more frequent, more reckless, and the guilt slowly faded behind their growing addiction to secrecy. Mark noticed the change in Lisa. Her phone was always in her hand, and she smiled at messages she never explained. She came home later, her perfume lingered differently, and her eyes avoided his. He started feeling like a stranger in his own home. The betrayal he had willingly allowed now haunted him in a way he couldn't control. He didn't have proof yet, but instinct told him everything he needed to know. Ethan's obsession grew darker. He started believing Lisa would leave her husband for him. He told Rachel he needed space and began inventing excuses to stay away from home. Rachel's intuition screamed that something was wrong. She tried to confront him, but his answers were cold and distant. Every attempt to reach him pushed him further away. She could feel her marriage slipping through her fingers, and anger replaced her hurt. Meanwhile, Lisa's guilt started to creep in. She told herself it was love, not betrayal, but every time she looked at Mark, she saw the quiet pain in his eyes. She tried to act normal, but her mind was divided. She wanted both comfort and thrill, stability and excitement. It was a dangerous balance that couldn't last forever. One afternoon, as Lisa was leaving to meet Ethan, she caught her reflection in the mirror and paused. She barely recognized the woman staring back. She saw the lies, the deception, the damage growing around her, yet she didn't stop. The pull of desire was stronger than her conscience. She got in her car and drove away, unaware that Mark had followed her this time. That moment marked the beginning of the end. Mark watched from a distance as his wife parked near a small motel. He saw Ethan step out and greet her. The sight shattered every piece of denial left in him. He didn't move, didn't make a scene, but something inside him broke completely. What started as a game between four people had turned into a nightmare of obsession and betrayal. None of them knew it yet, but the choices they had made that night in the cabin had already sealed their fate. The thrill they sought had unleashed something far darker than desire. It had awakened anger, jealousy, and vengeance that would soon destroy them all. Mark returned home that night in silence. The image of Lisa with Ethan played in his mind like a cruel film he couldn't stop watching. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them together, and it burned him from the inside. He sat in the darkness of their living room, trying to calm his thoughts, but the anger refused to leave. He couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Just weeks ago, he thought he was saving his marriage by trying something new. Now, he had become a stranger in his own life, betrayed, humiliated, and broken. Lisa came home later that evening, pretending nothing had happened. She moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to make eye contact. Mark studied her quietly, every movement, every word. He could see the guilt in the way she avoided him, but he said nothing. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. Lisa believed her secret was safe, unaware that Mark had seen everything. She continued her affair with Ethan, convinced that their connection was something deeper than lust. Ethan told her she was special, that she was the only one who truly understood him. His words made her feel alive, desired, and important again. But what she didn't realize was that Ethan's obsession was no longer romantic, it was dangerous. Ethan began pushing boundaries, showing up unexpectedly at places Lisa visited, calling her repeatedly when she didn't respond. His messages became demanding, almost desperate. He wanted more of her time, more of her attention. Lisa started to feel trapped between two worlds, her husband's growing suspicion and Ethan's suffocating attachment. She thought about ending the affair, but every time she tried, Ethan would pull her back with promises, apologies, and reminders of their secret bond. She didn't know that Ethan's wife, Rachel, was watching everything unfold with quiet fury. Rachel had sensed the truth long before it was confirmed. She noticed Ethan's distant behavior, his secretive phone calls, and the unfamiliar perfume on his clothes. One evening, she followed him, and what she discovered shattered her. From her car, she watched Ethan embrace Lisa outside a hotel. The betrayal cut deep, not just because her husband had cheated, but because it was with a woman she had considered a friend. Rachel drove home that night with trembling hands, her heart filled with rage and disbelief. She didn't confront him immediately. Instead, she waited and planned, determined to expose them both. Meanwhile, Mark's anger was taking on a new shape. He began recording Lisa's movements, saving screenshots of her messages, collecting proof of her betrayal. He didn't tell anyone what he knew. He simply watched and waited, his mind growing darker each day. The man who once loved her now felt only hate. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly, and started thinking about how to make her feel the same pain she had given him. One evening, Lisa came home to find Mark sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, which she had forgotten earlier that day. Her stomach tightened. She knew immediately that he had seen something. Still, he said nothing. He only gave her a cold look that made her blood run cold. That night, she couldn't sleep. The guilt was finally catching up to her, but the fear of what Mark might do was even stronger. Ethan, on the other hand, was unraveling. He had convinced himself that Lisa would leave Mark for him. When she started pulling away, trying to end things, he panicked. He began showing up at her workplace, sending her flowers, leaving notes on her car. Lisa begged him to stop, terrified that Mark would find out. But Mark already knew everything. He followed her one last time, just to be sure, and when he saw Ethan grab her arm in the parking lot, something inside him finally snapped. He didn't confront them then, but in his mind, a plan was already forming, a plan that would end everything once and for all. Rachel finally decided to confront her husband. She told him she knew everything, that she had seen the messages and the meetings. Ethan didn't deny it. Instead, he blamed her for their unhappy marriage, accusing her of being cold and distant. Rachel realized then that the man she had loved was gone. She told him she was leaving, but Ethan only laughed, certain that Lisa would replace her soon. His arrogance blinded him to the danger around him. He didn't indeed know that both Mark and Rachel were reaching their breaking points at the same time. The tension between all four grew unbearable. The affair had destroyed not just 2 marriages, but 4 lives. The web of lies and emotions was tangled beyond repair. Mark spent hours each night imagining different ways to confront them. He didn't want an argument. He wanted something final. He started buying supplies, things he claimed were for a weekend trip, but in truth, he was preparing for something far more sinister. Lisa, sensing Mark's strange behavior, tried to repair things. She suggested a small getaway, hoping it might ease the tension. Mark agreed immediately, his tone calm, his face unreadable. She thought it was a sign of forgiveness. In reality, it was the opposite. He had already decided how it would end. Ethan and Rachel were invited as well, under the pretense of mending their friendship and moving past their mistakes. Rachel was hesitant, but Ethan, still obsessed with Lisa, convinced her to go. None of them realized they were walking into a trap. In the days leading up to the trip, Mark became eerily calm. He smiled more, spoke gently, and acted as though everything was fine. Lisa began to relax, believing the storm had passed. But behind those calm eyes, Mark was consumed by rage and betrayal. He replayed every moment of deceit in his head, every lie she had told him, every time she had chosen Ethan over him. The pain no longer felt human, it had turned into something darker. The night before the trip, Mark stood by the window of their bedroom, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He thought about the years he had given her, the trust, the love, the sacrifices. None of it mattered now. The betrayal had erased everything. He whispered to himself that by this time next week, the pain would be over. He packed his bags calmly, double-checking everything, and went to bed beside Lisa, pretending to sleep. Lisa dreamed of peace, unaware that her fate was already sealed. Ethan dreamed of running away with her. Rachel dreamed of revenge. Mark dreamed of silence. 4 different dreams, all converging into one nightmare that none of them would escape from. By the time they left for that secluded lakeside cabin, the story that began with excitement and temptation had already transformed into one of jealousy, obsession, and deadly intent. The game that started with pleasure was about to end in blood. The lakeside cabin stood quietly among the trees, a place that looked peaceful from the outside, but was destined to hold one of the darkest nights of their lives. The water shimmered beneath the moonlight, and the air was cool and still. It should have been a place for relaxation, a weekend retreat to heal old wounds, but Mark's mind was already far from peace. He had chosen this cabin carefully isolated, private, far from neighbors or cell service. Everything was arranged to perfection. The others thought it was a spontaneous getaway, a chance to forget their mistakes. In truth, it was a carefully planned stage for what Mark had decided must happen. Lisa was the first to arrive with Mark, and though she tried to convince herself that this trip would mend things between them, An uneasy feeling clung to her. Mark's calmness was unnerving. He spoke softly, smiled occasionally, but there was something empty behind his eyes. When Ethan and Rachel arrived later in the evening, the air grew heavier. There was forced laughter, polite greetings, and a strange tension that everyone tried to ignore. They all knew there were unspoken wounds between them, but no one dared to bring them up. As night fell, Mark suggested they open a bottle of wine. It was his idea to relax, to toast to new beginnings. He poured the glasses himself, making sure everyone's drink was full. The others accepted without hesitation, unaware of the small amount of sedative he had mixed into each one. The substance wasn't meant to kill quickly, it was meant to slow them down, to make them weak and disoriented. Mark wanted control, and he wanted to look into their eyes when it happened. The first few hours went smoothly. The conversation flowed, the music played softly, and for a moment it seemed as if things might actually be normal. Lisa laughed a little too loudly, trying to erase the tension. Ethan flirted with her openly, his eyes lingering on her with desire. Rachel noticed every glance and sip, her face tightening with silent fury. Mark sat quietly, watching them all, his expression unreadable. He had imagined this moment for weeks, and now it was unfolding exactly as he planned. Gradually, the atmosphere began to change. The wine started taking effect. Lisa felt dizzy and lightheaded, her laughter slowing into confusion. Ethan rubbed his temples, struggling to focus, while Rachel slumped slightly in her chair. Mark stood up slowly, his face calm, and began walking around the table. None of them realized the danger until it was too late. Ethan tried to speak, but his words came out slurred. He looked up at Mark in confusion as his vision blurred. Mark's expression turned cold and sharp. He grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him to his feet, dragging him toward the door. Rachel tried to stand, but her body wouldn't respond. Lisa blinked in shock, her heart racing, unable to understand what was happening. The night air outside was colder now, and the sound of crickets filled the silence as Mark led Ethan toward the edge of the dock. What happened next was a blur of violence and rage. Mark's pent-up anger exploded all at once. The betrayal, the humiliation, the endless nights of imagining what they had done, it all fueled his fury. Ethan struggled weakly, but the sedative had dulled his strength. There was shouting, then a splash, then silence. When Mark returned to the cabin, his face was pale and blank, his shirt wet with water from the lake. Inside, Rachel was half-conscious, struggling to understand where Ethan had gone. Lisa, trembling, tried to reach for her phone, but Mark snatched it from her hand. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, cold, distant, and filled with quiet hatred. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Mark told her to stay seated with a gesture, then turned toward Rachel, who was now trying to crawl toward the door. Mark's fury turned next to her. Rachel had been part of the betrayal too, in his mind. She had encouraged the lifestyle, had joined in the game that destroyed his marriage. He saw them all as guilty, each deserving of punishment. He grabbed her by the arm, dragged her toward the back of the cabin, and what followed was chaos thuds, muffled cries, the sound of struggle. When it was over, Rachel lay motionless on the wooden floor. Lisa sat frozen, unable to move. Her mind raced between disbelief and terror. The man she had married, the man she once loved, was now a stranger, standing in the dim light with blood on his hands. Mark looked at her, breathing heavily, his eyes flickering between anger and exhaustion. He didn't speak, but his silence said enough. Lisa realized she was next. She bolted from her chair, stumbling toward the door. Mark chased after her, shouting her name. The cold night air hit her face as she ran barefoot toward the trees, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she could hear Mark's footsteps closing in. The forest was dark, the ground uneven, branches tearing at her clothes as she ran deeper into the woods. She could barely see, barely think, only move. Every breath felt like fire in her lungs. Mark caught up to her near the edge of the lake, grabbing her wrist and pulling her back. She struggled, clawing at his arm, but his grip was too strong. For a moment, they stood face to face, both gasping for air. Mark's rage faltered for just a second as he looked at her, the woman who had once been his entire world. That hesitation gave her a small chance. Lisa twisted free and shoved him backward before running again, vanishing into the darkness. For hours, the forest was filled with the sound of Mark calling her name and breaking branches as he searched. But she was gone. Exhausted and trembling, he returned to the cabin before sunrise. The bodies of Ethan and Rachel were still there, the air heavy with silence. He sat down in the same chair where they had all laughed hours earlier and stared blankly at the table. The candles had burned out. The wine glasses were tipped over. The night had swallowed everything. When the morning light began to creep through the windows, Mark walked outside to the dock. The lake was calm, almost beautiful, as if nothing terrible had happened. He watched the ripples move across the surface, his mind empty. He told himself that it was over, that the pain would finally stop, but deep inside he knew it wasn't finished. Lisa was still out there somewhere, and her survival meant the truth would surface. The calm he felt began to fade into dread. By the time he stumbled back into the house, he could already hear faint sirens in the distance. The sound echoed faintly through the forest, growing louder. Someone had called for help, perhaps a nearby fisherman, perhaps Lisa. Mark looked down at his hands, trembling, realizing that no amount of rage could undo what he had done. The weekend meant to heal his marriage had ended in destruction. The game that began as fantasy had turned into a nightmare that none of them could escape. The morning after the violence, the cabin looked calm from the outside, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But inside, the silence was thick and unnatural. The air carried the sharp scent of spilled wine and blood. The broken furniture and scattered glass were silent witnesses to the chaos that had taken place only hours before. The early sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. Mark sat slumped on the couch, staring blankly at the mess around him. His shirt was stained, his hands still trembling, his eyes hollow. He couldn't tell how long he had been sitting there. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, each second echoing in his head like a reminder of the reality he couldn't escape. He could hear faint sounds outside, the distant hum of a boat engine on the lake, the soft chirping of morning birds. For a moment, he almost convinced himself that everything had been a dream, some kind of hallucination. But then his gaze fell on the two motionless figures on the floor, and the truth came crashing back. Ethan and Rachel lay still, their faces pale, their lives gone. Mark's breathing grew heavy as guilt and rage battled inside him. He tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, as though the weight of what he had done had drained every bit of strength from his body. He stumbled toward the sink, splashed cold water on his face, and stared into the cracked mirror above it. The man staring back at him looked older, broken, almost unrecognizable. He whispered something to himself that he couldn't even understand. Then he turned toward the door and stepped outside, hoping the cold air would clear his head. The morning fog rolled across the lake, and for a brief moment, everything was still, but that stillness carried danger. Somewhere out there, Lisa was hiding, terrified, possibly injured, but alive. And Mark knew that as long as she lived, the truth of what happened would come out. He began searching the woods again, his shoes crunching against the damp leaves. He called her name softly, his voice trembling, hoping she might respond. But there was nothing. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees. Every shadow made him flinch, every sound made his heart race. Hours passed before he finally gave up, returning to the cabin, exhausted and covered in dirt. His mind spun between regret and fear. He wanted to believe he hadn't meant for things to go that far, but the memory of his actions told him otherwise. Meanwhile, the outside world had already started to close in. A fisherman, who had been out early that morning, noticed something strange floating near the dock. When he got closer, he saw a body and immediately called the police. Within an hour, patrol cars and investigators were surrounding the lake. The quiet retreat had become a crime scene. Mark, still dazed and lost in thought, didn't even realize they had arrived until he saw flashing lights through the trees. When officers entered the cabin, they found him sitting at the table, motionless as if waiting for them. He didn't resist when they placed him in handcuffs. His expression was blank, his mind somewhere far away. The detectives looked around the room in disbelief. They saw two bodies, blood on the floor, signs of a violent struggle, and the absence of one more person, Lisa. Her belongings were still in the cabin, her shoes by the door, her phone on the counter, but she was gone. Mark was taken into custody and transported to the nearest station for questioning. During the ride, he stared out the window, the flashing lights reflecting in his eyes. When they asked what had happened, he gave vague, fragmented answers. He said there had been a fight, that things got out of control, and that he couldn't remember everything. His voice was low, almost lifeless, and the detectives exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen many crime scenes before, but something about this one felt different, more personal, more emotional, almost ritualistic in its violence. At the cabin, the forensic team began piecing together the story. They collected fingerprints, photographs, and samples. The overturned wine glasses and traces of sedatives in the remaining bottle told them that someone had been drugged. The bloody footprints led from the living room to the door and then toward the dock. Outside, near the water's edge, they found another set of smaller prints that seemed to lead into the forest. Lisa's. The trail was faint but enough to confirm that she had escaped that night. A search team was immediately formed to comb through the surrounding woods. Dogs were brought in, and drones scanned the area from above. Hours passed, then a full day, but there was no sign of Lisa. Some officers began to believe she might have drowned in the lake while trying to escape, but others weren't convinced. There were traces of blood in the woods, suggesting she had been injured but kept moving. They continued to search as night fell again, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Back at the station, detectives pressed Mark for more answers. He claimed that after the argument turned violent, he blacked out and didn't remember how things ended. When asked about Lisa, his voice broke slightly and he said he thought she had run away. His story was inconsistent, his emotions unpredictable. One moment he seemed regretful, the next, cold and distant. The investigators could tell there was more to the story, but without Lisa, they couldn't piece everything together. The case quickly drew media attention. The idea of a wife swap party that had turned deadly spread like wildfire. News outlets called it a twisted tragedy fueled by lust, jealousy, and obsession. Neighbors described all four as friendly and normal, unable to believe what had happened. But behind the headlines, detectives continued their quiet search, following every small clue that might lead to Lisa. 2 days later, the weather turned stormy. Rain poured down, washing away many of the footprints and traces left behind. The search teams were exhausted, their hope fading. It was then that one of the officers found a piece of torn fabric caught on a branch deep in the forest. It matched the color of the dress Lisa had been wearing. Nearby, faint impressions of bare feet led further into the woods toward a rocky slope. They followed the trail carefully, hearts pounding, knowing they were close. As the sun began to rise again, a detective spotted something partially buried under the wet leaves near the slope. It was a small hand. The search stopped. The team stood in silence as they uncovered the body, lying in a shallow grave hastily covered with dirt and leaves. It was Lisa. Her skin was pale, her hair tangled with twigs, and her body bore the marks of struggle. She had made it far, almost to the road, before collapsing. When Mark was told they had found her, he didn't react. He simply lowered his head and whispered something no one could hear. Later, under interrogation, he confessed in fragments. He admitted that he had gone after her in the woods, that she had tried to run, and that in a moment of rage, he struck her. He said he didn't mean to kill her, that he only wanted to stop her, but the damage was done. The cabin that once stood as a place of laughter and temptation had become a scene of horror. Every piece of evidence told a story of human weakness, jealousy, and rage spiraling into destruction. The investigation revealed how quickly a single reckless choice could unravel everything. By the time the authorities finished their work, 3 lives were gone, and one man's sanity was lost forever. The once beautiful lakeside retreat now stood abandoned, a silent reminder of how easily passion could turn to violence and love could decay into something monstrous. As the days passed after the horrific discovery, the small suburban town could no longer pretend to be peaceful. The brutal crime that had taken place inside the Morales house became the center of endless speculation. Police tape surrounded the once inviting home, and every news channel featured aerial footage of the crime scene. Reporters gathered outside, trying to piece together what had really happened the night the so-called Foursome turned deadly. The remaining survivor, Erica, was nowhere to be seen. She had been hospitalized for shock, her mind shattered by the horror she had witnessed or perhaps by something darker that no one yet understood. Detectives began to dig deeper into the couple's private lives. What they found made the case even more disturbing. There were thousands of messages exchanged between the two couples, some about their fantasies, others about jealousy, threats, and hidden desires. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this arrangement had never been just about pleasure. There were traces of envy and manipulation in every conversation. Investigators began to suspect that the deadly night was not a spontaneous outburst of passion gone wrong, but a carefully laid trap by someone who wanted revenge. Forensics revealed a chilling detail. The fire that destroyed most of the evidence had been started with accelerants found in the garage. Someone had poured gasoline before the chaos erupted. It wasn't an accident, it was premeditated. That discovery changed everything. The case shifted from an act of rage to a planned murder. The question was, who had done it and why? The only living witness, Erica, claimed she remembered nothing. But her inconsistencies didn't sit right with the investigators. They noticed she kept changing small details like who poured the drinks or who locked the back door. Weeks later, as police reconstructed the night step by step, they found an unsettling twist. One of the victims, Kevin, had taken out a large life insurance policy just 2 months before his death, naming Erica as the sole beneficiary. The amount was enough to raise suspicion, nearly $500,000. Friends of the couple said Erica had been struggling with money and constantly complained about her marriage. She often hinted that she wanted to start over. The timing, the money, and her inconsistent statements painted a picture no one wanted to believe. When detectives went through surveillance footage from nearby stores, they discovered that 2 days before the incident, Erica had purchased several gallons of gasoline. She claimed it was for a weekend barbecue that never happened. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. The detectives obtained a warrant to search her belongings again. Hidden inside her suitcase, they found a small notebook filled with disturbing entries. The pages described her resentment toward Kevin and Lavra, her envy of Tony's wealth, and her fantasy of being free and starting a new life. One final note read like a confession. If only they were gone, I'd finally be free. With mounting evidence, Erica was arrested and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder and arson. The trial drew nationwide attention, turning into a media circus. The prosecution painted her as a calculating woman who used the wife swap arrangement to manipulate everyone involved. According to their theory, Erica had seduced all three, setting them up against one another until the tension exploded. On the night of the crime, she had allegedly spiked their drinks, started the fire, and left them to die. The defense argued that she was traumatized and confused, insisting that someone else had planned the killings. As the trial continued, shocking revelations emerged. Forensic experts testified that 2 sets of fingerprints were found on the gas can Erica and Tony's. This twist reopened the possibility that Tony might have been involved, but he was already dead. Some speculated that Erica and Tony had planned the murders together, each driven by greed and lust, and that something went terribly wrong during the act. The theory gained traction when phone records showed Erica and Tony had been exchanging secret messages for weeks before the event, plotting to end it all. In the final week of the trial, Erica's composure began to crack. Witnesses described her as cold and emotionless, showing no sign of remorse. When the jury returned their verdict, the courtroom was silent. Erica was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yet even as she was led away, a faint smile crossed her face, as if she knew something the world didn't. Months later, new evidence surfaced that made the entire case even murkier. Detectives found a hidden camera in the Morales house that had recorded the night of the murders. The footage was partially destroyed by fire, but a few fragments were recovered. In one chilling clip, Erica appeared terrified, screaming and running from Tony, who was holding the gas can. He looked wild and unstable, not like a man in control of his senses. Moments later, the screen went black. The discovery raised haunting questions. Had Erica truly masterminded the killings, or had she become trapped in Tony's madness? Was her notebook a confession or a desperate attempt to make sense of her trauma? The truth became blurred between fact and perception, and even the investigators couldn't agree on what really happened that night. The Morales house was eventually demolished, but locals said the ground still felt cursed. Some claimed they saw flickering lights in the vacant lot or heard faint cries echoing from the empty space where the living room once stood. The tragedy became a grim legend, a warning about how obsession, jealousy, and deceit could turn pleasure into death. Erica spent her days in prison isolated from the rest of the inmates, often staring blankly through her cell window. She rarely spoke and never explained her side again. Reporters who tried to interview her received only silence. To this day, the full truth of what happened that night remains buried beneath the ashes of that house, along with 3 lives consumed by fire and 1 by guilt. The story of the deadly wife swap became one of the most disturbing cases in modern true crime history. It exposed how fragile human desire can be when mixed with envy and deceit. What started as a thrill among couples searching for excitement ended as a cautionary tale of destruction. The case continues to haunt those who study it, not only because of its violence but because no one can say for sure who was the real monster that night, the killer or the victims themselves.